because it means something. So this is myself and my sister and my grandma at the bottom, and the one at the top is both my grandmas, and the one on the right is probably an image that's seen or used quite a lot of white settler or British colonial government and what they were doing to the communities in Kenya. I am a Kikuyu, so I'm also aware in terms of resistance, this Kikuyu community kind of resisted a lot in terms of what was being taken from them, the land and the resources and the forced displacements, and kept under very oppressive kind of conditions. So for me, similar to the PhD, it starts here because what I've now really been unpacking and understanding is the role that my family played in the resistance, particularly my grandfather. And my grandma, who's sat next to me, tells tales of when Granddad got locked up and what they encountered and being held in these reservation camps, and the working conditions and the living conditions and the torture and the violence that came with that. And then the grandma at the top went into a missionary school and learned to read and write, and came out to teach the Bible and Christian living and ways of living. So in ordinary times, grandma on the left would not have hanged out with grandma on the right, because grandma on the right was a radical. Grandma on the right was like wanted to hold on to the tradition and the customs, could not read and write, but the other one could. And it's only later that they really realized what actually happened. And I think it's with this kind of in mind that in terms of the impact of occupation, in terms of impact of where we are right now, that I feel it's really important to hold on to this, at least to be aware of this, because when we hear where they come in here, or when we hear about people who are like the weather conditions or not being able to deal with whatever's coming at them, if we're not aware of these histories, then we're actually doing a disservice to that. So the next slide, please. So the things I wanted to bear in mind, as I said, it was around land and labor and resource. This is what or how the British and many other, because obviously in Kenyan context it's the British, we have other Europeans after the 1884 and the division, and decided to go and take up in whatever part of the country that, or part of the Africa that they wanted. It was very much around land, labor, and resource. And the promise of labor for the ones who actually originally arrived in Kenya, were the elite, was, yeah, you can get as much labor as this, and you can buy this much land or get this much land. What the story that they hadn't been told is actually people are being forcefully removed from the land. And I don't know whether they cared actually when they got there and realized that. But it's also the resources are on the land, not just the climate, the conditions. And in a way, and this kind of like ties to the point around humanizing, or the dialectics of humanizing and dehumanizing. The concept that was sold was very much around barbaric. Communities are barbaric. We're going to civilize them. They cannot take care of themselves, and therefore we're going in there to help or get them. They've got something that they don't even understand. And I think it's such, the reason I kind of talk about the myth or the trickery around this is obviously anybody who studied even African history, African civilization before that, is aware and knows that all of these things were there much before the Moors even arrived in Europe. So all of these things were there, and it's just a trickery that happened around written scriptures and all of that changed. And then the people were traveling, or the Europeans, originally the explorers, then followed by the missionaries, and then the people came in to really take what they wanted. All of that stories, the stories that came on, kind of created this concept of they were not humans. They were the dehumanizing element of they're kind of closer to animals. And this justified, as I see it, it justified the oppression or the realities of what would follow on in terms of torture. And we know this, obviously I'm talking about colonialism, but even when we kind of consider and think of the enslavement of people and the human trafficking of people, shackled, in ships and brought out, there is no way anybody who kind of thinks or considers people humans or not one of them would be able to do that with a clean heart. You have to do something first to change the concept, to then allow yourself to do that. And that same thing applies with the subject and not object kind of concept of when you objectify people, when you objectify a thing, including what we have done now to the planet, then we feel we have rights to, and they have no choice, or it has no choice, and therefore we're able to do what we want. And the effect of this, because in terms of the dismembering, I say this as a detachment and a pulling away from, a tearing away from. And the reason I want us to kind of also remember this word is because the continuation is kind of almost similar. When I come later on to kind of like describe some of those concepts, it's a continuation is similar. But when you tear something from somewhere, the tear is on the thing that you're pulling away from, but the tear is also on what's left behind. And that tear, when you think of it as human concept, you're tearing families, you're tearing communities, you're tearing cultures, you're tearing all of that. But the land itself, you're tearing people from a land, and that thing is no longer whole. It's damaged. It's something. And how do we move forward from that? Because that, as I think it's Angela Davis that uses the unpeopling of people. And that concept or idea of hierarchy, which kind of is really like ingrained or begins to be ingrained there, man over, a white man over, but then man over the planet, and everything is there for them to take. And that tearing is, I think, what we see right now, we continue to see right now, is a crying out of not just the climate, it's a crying out of people and behaviors and characteristics that we see right now. But the thing that I really kind of want to question is the trickery that went with, and the question being whether we really pathologize that concept of how we even got there. Because I think I've been listening to I think Doga, spiritual leader, who talks about healing and repair. And he kind of like almost explains that Europeans, for instance, came to Africa to heal. They were running away from something. Something was going on, and they came for that. They came for some healing, as opposed to they came to save Africa. Kind of turning the situation back on its head. And it's in a way, if they're already unwell and they're coming for healing, but rather than seek healing, they end up kind of like passing it on. What is it that we see right now? Do we, as I say, do we pathologize that the fact that the state that we're in right now really started from that concept or the racialization of people as well? Because I know I have had this before, that yes, slavery existed before the Europeans got involved, and all of the other kind of explanations that we've had, but there wasn't what I'd consider the racializing of people, or when race kind of became, or ethnicity became played a part in this. That's when the situation got much worse. So move on to the next slide. And I think also I wanted to kind of put this, because I probably mentioned some of this anyway, but I just wanted to kind of like mention these as important terminologies because they matter. And just kind of like quick explanations is obviously like when you talk about colonialism, is that they're taking over, they're ruling over and controlling a people through governments and whatever else. But when you talk about coloniality or colonial legacies, is the lasting effect and the fact that we exist within that concept right now, because there wasn't like colonialism's come and gone and it's ended. But the one that is of real, also for me, I tend to focus on a lot is racism and racialism, because racism is the structural stuff, it's the systemic, it's the one that's like bound within buildings, within practices, within everything else. And racialism is the one that tends to be individual. So when somebody's, I'm out there and they tell me whatever they want to tell me, that is kind of falls under racialism. But when but this racialism is supported and reinforced by racism, because the power that people have, individual power that people have, really comes from the state as well. And we can talk about all sorts of things, whether we think of migration policies, we think of policing, we think of health sector. All of these places are kind of like the connection or between racism and racialism. The anti-Blackness, again, worth mentioning, because racial kind of minorities are kind of like a whole broad range, or when we kind of put them in that bracket. But the lowest denominator at all times and at all places, and we've seen this even with what's happening with Ukraine and other places, is Blackness or anti-Blackness that exists. And sometimes the reason I mention this is because this is also used to kind of divide even within the communities of color, in terms of whose oppression is most, or when we all put in one blanket, as opposed to really understanding the difference or the differential treatments that come in within, and the lowest denominator here being around Blackness. And then the whiteness being is a system too, similar to, it's not just being white, it's the power that comes with it. Internalized racism is something, again, maybe pointing out a few people, like recent reports and things like that, where people who are also racialized either not only accept the powerlessness, but also continue in terms of the replication or passing on, whether it's giving passes to people and saying, actually, this is not oppression, I'm okay with it, to being the people who are used by the system to manipulate, to oppress their own communities. And epistemicide, which I'll talk about when I'm talking about, I'll talk about that one when I'm talking about the pillars. But the microaggressions is kind of what we tend to notice or talk about a lot, in terms of certain comments that you get that are loaded, and the person who's saying it sometimes is aware, sometimes isn't. But it's important to remember these terminologies because they come up a lot. If we go to the next slide, please. So yeah, for me, the pillars of domination, and I should say this also was partly motivated to, including the work at RGN, really was motivated by the conversations around equality and diversity, and really feeling that it's not really addressing the root cause of all of what the world that we exist and live in. Because it was like, as long as we're fighting or asking for representation, and representation is meaning like we wanting a few black or brown faces in a room, the problem is solved. But actually not, because some of us who end up in those rooms, depending on like class or education level, sometimes we're actually still dressed underneath with the same robes of like white superiority or whiteness, or promoting and supporting it. So it kind of doesn't really resolve. But also the idea of equal is equal to what, or equal to whom, and the concept also, which again I'll talk about in the next one, of really we're not addressing where we are in terms of the power imbalance and where this power imbalance came from. So when I started really thinking through was, how is it that I'm sat here or studying here and talking about racism, and I haven't really, and it doesn't seem to go away, because the more I'm reading up, these others have been doing this and much fiercer, and others have done other things. Why is it that it's not shifting? Why is it that we've not made progress? Partly because the system is created in a way that kind of exhausts us. And that was also the reason for me thinking I'm not really interested in sitting and spending time just talking about racism, and that's it, because the work is not to just talk about it. The work really is about how do we dismantle, how do we make situations or change the systems that we live in. So because of this exhaustion, I think yeah, so that was one of the reasons. And then the other one was like, so if people have done it and it hasn't shifted, what is it that makes it so hard to shift? And that's when I came about, or at least started to kind of play with the idea of the pillars of domination. And this is obviously, like, as I said, it's coming through with my PhD, because my PhD, I've had to go back in terms of colonialism. To talk about coloniality, I needed to talk about colonialism and what actually happened, and who was affected, how are they affected, where are they now, and all of that. And the structures that I really like saw as the thing that's really stepped in and has stayed and maintained its hold is these pillars, because underneath, in a little bit, probably it's not very clear, but underneath in the yellow bit, I kind of was trying to think of what was there before, because we did have structures of governance before colonizers landed. We did have ways of practice in terms of spirituality before the religion or Christian religion, other religions landed. We did have a culture, we did have a language, we did have traditions and ways of passing skills from one generation to another. We had ways of exchanging goods and ways of ensuring that we're not taking advantage of each other. We had ways of looking after the elderly, the sick, the poor, the young, all of that. So what is it that was there? Why is it that when the colonizers arrived, what is it that they brought that has meant that this damage started, the damage to the psyches started and has kept its hold? And that's why, and then I kind of concluded on this one. So I started as the education, because one of the things that they came with, again, after explorers and then the missionaries, was schools. And within the schools, yes, you'd go and learn, but you were only taught up to a certain level, but up to enough English that you could be a worker, a good worker. And again, this is from my grandparents and my family, including my dad. You just needed enough education to take orders and play a good role. And in a way, also, as I'm explaining these pillars, they also, the reason I say that they reinforce each other, and why, if one is, if you take one, the thing doesn't fall apart, it's still there, and then the other one comes back up again. It's because, so in this case, you're being taught in school, but you're also being taught a religion, and we know religion and the way it's been taught is very, not only Eurocentric, it's there, it kind of brings in a situation of harming or justifying the abuse, or justifying the Black or Africans or other people of color as underneath or less than. So once you get an education, you get religious, you kind of held in certain realms of society. The ones who managed to go so far also got jobs, and they got jobs in the government. They got jobs as clerks. They got jobs as so in a way, it was reinforcing the ones who chose to go on this tunnel compared to the others, like my other grandma, who didn't. And that way of being, you're benefiting from an economic system, because suddenly now you're seeing yourself as similar to, or at least aspiring to be as close to whiteness as possible. And then the violence, and the violence, and this tied quite closely with the governance, is they're also creating laws that allow or disallow people to do certain things, again catering for the elite, or the if you kind of want to call it the 1%. So the policing, the law, the legislation that's being passed, whether it's from hat tax that you had to send back to the Queen, to you're not allowed to congregate, movement restrictions. Again, the reason I say this is because we see the same things right now, movement restrictions on your own land. You had to have a pass hanging on your neck to go from one village to another and explain why you're going from one place to another. And if you didn't, the people would punish you, the colonial government, and some of them were home guards who are also Kenyan. And again, this is where talking about the damage to the psyche and the aspirations of, and I think Fanon talks about this, explores this quite a bit, and the violence that comes with it, whether it's through the law, it's through the education, miseducation, it's through the taking of your land, which was a major resource, forcing you to go and have to work for the white settler farmers, it's unspeakable, because there was, the killings and torture, but there's also the mental, as I'd say, the slow one, and also the one I mentioned earlier, the epistemic violence, because this is where the traditions, the culture, and language is everything is being cut down. So you're no longer of yourself, you become of somebody else, and you're being taught something that really doesn't cater for you and your needs and your people. So if, for instance, if we're talking, the Africans led a spiritual way of life where they respected the land, they respected the people, they respected the elders, they respected the people who are disabled. If anything, they were revered as gods. And then comes a system that kind of does away with all of that, and now you're told something else, but this thing that you're being told doesn't really cater to you. And for me, it's all of these pillars that have continued till now, because the education system, for instance, that was started then, we've continued it. And then, if anything, the religious practices now are very much of almost shutting down any dissent, shutting down any challenge to whether it's the powers that be, because, hey, we could just pray and things will get better, or we can just go and tithe more, and also the idea of material wealth. You're going in to pray, you're educating yourself to get a good job and get a big car and a big house without real much of a reflection on what that means to the rest of society. Because if you're amassing loads of wealth, what does that mean for the poor in your community? If you're gaining all of this, what does that mean to the planet? So all of this pulling away from the practices that were there before is part of the damage, as we kind of see and continue to recognize now. So the Western ideology that kind of was planted continues. So we have a police that continues to do exactly the same. As yes, it's a Black police policing a Black community, but the people who are targeted most usually are the poor, especially the urban poor. And then we have like an elite system of the people who've taken over in government, who are usually, who came from the loyalists, who were able to travel abroad, come study, go back, take over the government. It caters to those. So they become untouchable. So they are able to take and grab whatever they want, but the poor people in the community, so it's the same structures as we have here, continues. I'll go on to the next one, please. So the effects of, as I see it, is in terms of the pillar, and in terms of right here, right now, is how we see and hear of the media, for instance. Obviously, there's been a bit of a recent change. I'm not sure how long or what is actually going on because of the whole Ukrainian situation. We've seen, for example, some media become quite positive with migration and people opening the doors to, but I think the element that's kind of hidden within this is who is it that we're opening doors to, and what does it mean? Because the day before, 100,000 people have said yes to that, and Priti Patel is yes to allowing Ukrainians to come and work, but at the same time, people have not been allowed to work, who are going through the asylum process, have not been allowed to work for at least 20 years, or about 20 years. And also how they're kind of portrayed in the media as well. And then obviously they voted with the bill. So there's the things that the pillars are upheld right now, will continue to be upheld by the media, by the law and the legislation, by the education systems, by the banks and the foreign policies, and the religion that continues to. And as much as because it was also a shock for me, I think, when I got here, to kind of see people are not as religious as the places where they took the religions to. But what I definitely acknowledge, it's ingrained in the work ethic or the practices. So it's not as visible as turning up on Sunday and spending the whole day in church, but it's definitely ingrained in other ways, including the exclusions of people who do not practice a certain way or who do not live a certain way. We just don't call it the religion. And then there's the mental, physical, and epistemic violence, as I said, because of the language and the culture or acculturation that we talk about. And this one is, again, is hidden in sometimes when we talk about integration, or when we talk about inclusion, or when we talk about equality, because when we're really asking for that, we're also in a way asking the people to, it's really assimilation, it's them let go. And the uniqueness of what happened even with colonialism still remains that the colonizers who arrived did not come in to sit and live alongside us happily ever after. They came in to rule and take over. And the anxiety, and I think this is kind of when I think about what is it and why is it that the things we have right now are the way they are, it's almost the anxiety of what could happen from that damage that started and that is outlived or kind of continues to live on. This is the anxiety around that perhaps means that people really do not want to go there. So anti-Blackness I've kind of spoken about, but the global inequality in terms of wealth, in terms of, again, and this will be examples of like when people travel. One of the things that kind of really hit me in my face when I came here was how bad the treatment was. And then when I'm thinking, our culture and our people very much about hospitality and encouragement. Just put the lights on because it's getting dark. The encouragement for welcoming others, but when it came to us, or when I came here, I was like, oh my God. So that in itself, and the fact that people are migrating for what? So therefore, when people travel abroad, the difference of experience of like, I've done it when I've traveled abroad with family, friends from here who are white, and the experience that they get of like even the banks and they're being told not to queue up and all of that. This is part of the damage to the psyches I was talking about in terms of, and that is what, again, further on I talk about white power, because the association of white with power and wealth and wealth with white and power means that there's things that continue to open, and things that even without necessarily doing anything, without necessarily asking anything, the way the legacies of colonialism means that that association is there and exists. And if we try and pretend it doesn't, we're doing a disservice to the system. And when it's called out, it's not about obviously like the discomfort. I'm aware that there is discomfort, but it's not really about making people uncomfortable just for the sake of it. It's really about how do we use what we have to push forward. And the reason I kind of like paid also attention to the climate damage is because obviously we're talking about it now. We've seen what's happening right now in terms of displacement, in terms of collapse. But those other countries, especially who are still having things taken from them, having contracts that were signed and in debt or indebted to countries in Europe, are not able to cater or respond to. So, and at the same time, even with the repairs that we're asking or the solutions that we're coming up with, it still means we're going and taking further from those communities in terms of whether we're talking about cycling, where is the rubber coming from? When you're talking about electric cars, where is that coming from? What does that mean? So we're still kind of continuing, which is why I kind of like wanted to really mention it about and fossil fuels, wherever they're coming from. So it's kind of being aware of all of these kind of games or other things in playing all at the same time. The hostile environment, I wanted to mention it particularly because it kind of lays quite closely with the pillars, as I said, of movement. Who's allowed, who's human, who's or dehumanizing, or who's not allowed. So we had the segregation, we had apartheid, or still have, because I feel like the hostile environment is apartheid, but obviously we don't want to say that because it's a route for one people to do and live and exist, and another route for other people. And their reason for not being allowed to exist the same as others is really where they were born and the reasons why they've traveled, and definitely also around their ethnicity. It's clearly now we can see who is okay to and who isn't. So the reason for seeing this as a continuation of is the violence that comes with migration policies, and whether it's not people maybe not being shot similar to what was happening when they resisted or there was a resistance, but there's still the slow torture, and the people we engage and work with who tell you about being here 17 years, even being here 1 year, and being dehumanized in the ways that happens is a continuation of. And that idea of they're coming here to take from, because I don't want to just see the effects of coloniality just as a thing from the African or Black side. That effect is here in terms of our mental, how we see, how we regard, how we respond to people is very much tied to that history. I've spoken about the diversity is one of the reasons, obviously, for pushing and challenging what I felt was really to get to the bottom of it. We needed to get down to the colonial legacies, because diversity is not doing anything, but also that continuation of being and having to be comfortable, making people comfortable, even in our challenge for justice. And I remember a time, when I met some activists in Brazil, and I remember one woman who got up and spoke and said, when you've been trying to speak and nobody's hearing you, what you're left with is a scream, something in kind of the translation or something in that line. Because when you've been hurt and when you're hurting so bad and you're still not being heard, we know most people you will scream. And why do you do that? Because you've tried all other means and you haven't. And to get to a point where even when we're seeking justice and when we're pushing for or challenging things, we're still being asked to kind of package it or put it in a certain way or make people comfortable, including the oppressors, is such an injustice to the communities. And the idea of equity or inequity, as I said before, is the fact we're never starting on an equal par. Whether it's those jobs that we're seeking, if English is not first language, if you're educated differently, which is kind of my case, it means you're not really, you can't be, like, there's no, even if you bring equality there, it cannot work because inequity exists. Similar to other oppressions that people face, whether they're visible or invisible, of cultures, of food they eat, all of these things mean that if we're not starting on an equal par, forever, some of us are being pushed behind the glass ceilings or the invisible hand that kind of keeps us down. And also this one, that's why I've spoken about white power, but the one around compassion and empathy as ones who deserve and who don't deserve empathy. And we know these stories of people who either through the health system are not being treated as they should, and part of it, or being pain or the deaths or mortality rates is partly tied to, again, with the anti-Blackness, who gets sympathy and who's humanized and who's allowed those qualities as well. So in terms of how, maybe we can move to the next one, please. So yeah, go back to the last one. So in terms of this, I wanted us to just kind of like really consider some of the experiences we've had. So I thought it'd be good. I've been speaking a while now, need to pause for a little bit. But also I thought it'd be good to ask people maybe for a couple of minutes to think back or recall a moment of when they were angry or they experienced injustice or were in crisis. To just kind of recall that moment. And again, maybe to yourself, if you've got a pen and paper, maybe you can write it. If you don't, it's fine, because you're not going to share it. I'm not asking anybody to share it. I just want you to kind of like hold on to that moment when you experience injustice. It could be when you were younger, it could be now, it could be as yesterday, it could be anywhere. And what that moment was, and how you felt. And I just kind of like give 2 minutes. In terms of what was coming up within you, and what the feeling of what would you have wanted, or how was that injustice rectified or not rectified? What was it that was going on? Okay, we'll come back and maybe move on to the next slide now. And I'll start with a quote by Walter Rodney, who some of you might be familiar. He wrote the book on how Europe underdeveloped Africa. And this quote says, "By what standard of morality can the violence used by a slave to break chains be considered the same as the violence of a slave master?" And when I saw this, I really the point I was making about the woman in Brazil, or the point of protest, was really around when you've been pressed and pushed so hard, and then you react, or you're fighting for your liberation, or you're challenging or something, and then that becomes the measure. That's what you're told is wrong. And I think we've seen this with now, even with the attacks on CRT, critical race theory, because people are feeling like, okay, we pushed hard. It's worse. People feel worse for being called racist than they do for the action that they actually took. But what we tend to focus on is the reaction, as opposed to what actually was going on. What have they been under? And when you think of this in terms of the experience that maybe you've recalled, what I am aware of is the kind of the helplessness that kind of comes in. And this is throughout in terms of previous and current experiences, the helplessness that comes through on, and I was writing today for my PhD, and I was telling a story of a child who's 6 and was left with 3 other siblings, one being a 2-month-old child, in this reservation camps, and the mother is working in under the, being watched by the home guard and the colonial masters. And this 2-month-old baby is crying. Usually the child is kind of, she's not even 6, but she looks after the 3 other children, because that's kind of like how it was at the time. And on this day, child's not stopping to cry. So she walks several miles to go try and find the mother, because she thinks something's definitely wrong. Arrives there with this child and tells the other 2 children, a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, to hide somewhere in the bushes. So she goes and finds the mother, because she wants the mother to breastfeed, because the child might stop then. Anyway, before she arrives at where the mother is, the home guard sees her, strikes her, child lands on one side, and the baby lands on the other. And then he proceeds to kind of kick her with the boot. And the mother of these children watched without saying anything, because of the consequence and the implication of her intervening. And then eventually this home guard says, who's the mother of this child? Take it or silence it, whatever. Takes and silences, and then finishes, hands the child back to the 6-year-old, and the 6-year-old takes that child, and the other 2 are hiding in the bush back home. And this is the person I was interviewing. And it's that helplessness. And I think when we think even of the police, when people are wanting to intervene, and sometimes we see it as complacent, or we see it as of being complicit, is that helplessness of, if I do something, something worse will happen. If I don't do anything, something worse happens to me, in terms of how you live with that. And I think this is an experience for most people who are facing oppressions, because I know we've all experienced stuff at one time or another, of taking action or not taking action. You're put in a place where you're not comfortable. And the dual consciousness or double consciousness concept of, you're already considering the other person. And this is things that most oppressed communities do, of before you even take your action, you're already double guessing and putting yourself in the shoes of your oppressor, how you feel. And this is a thing, like even again, gendered, race, disability. Before you even speak up and ask for help, you're already asking, you're considering them, who are perhaps in much better position than yourself. And then there's the issue of retelling of traumas for others' learning. And sometimes if it's not painful enough, and this is the feeling you get, if it's not dramatic, if it's not as bad, it's not worthy, or we don't need to rescue, there's not empathy. And the other feeling around being disbelieved or not being heard. So despite of all of these things, as long as somebody hasn't experienced that thing that you're talking about, it doesn't exist, which is why I kind of put it there. If you can't see it, doesn't exist. If you've not experienced it, it doesn't exist. And then there's also the the concept around performative actions, well-meaning actions, or they mean well, but actually it's not doing anything to shift you from the position that you're in, and what that does. But the idea around this really is around the burden being carried by the people, both who are witnessing, and Mamadi, those of you who've experienced Mamadi, talks about this man who beats a dog every morning, and you kind of watch and walk past. The trauma passes on around all of us, in terms of whether we're witnessing or whether we're acting or whether we're the ground that is around seeing all of this. So I'd like you to kind of, so another reason I wanted to do that is because sometimes it's harder to understand others, because there's all this thing about obviously lived experience and trauma informed, but people who are not of that necessarily of that lived experience thinking if it's not, then they can't really have compassion or understand or feel. But we can always understand oppression, we can understand injustice, because we've all experienced and faced it at one time or another. So I'd like us to close that bit and maybe move on to the final slide, I hope, about what we should be doing. Or because again, for me, as much as there is kind of delivering and doing these talks, there's always a wish for me or for us to move forward, not to just sit with the horrible, things are really bad and things are really tough, and we sit and live with that. There's always an idea of moving forward. What do we do? And how do we support, and kind of like that kind of idea of solidarity? What does it actually mean in essence? So for me, it's kind of like revisiting the 5 pillars. I've explained the 5 pillars back then. The 5 pillars still in existence now. So if we are really interested in shifting and changing narratives, is to tackle them within those pillars. And some of you, as I said, I'm kind of like recognized a few of you. I'm aware that these people were doing all sorts of things, involved in all sorts of activisms. And I also imagine the reason for you either even coming on this course and being with us as you have been is because you either you found your purpose or you're finding your purpose, and you want to kind of do something with who you are and your existence in terms of betterment of society. So with that in mind, then it's really shifting and thinking, what part of the pillars are you working on, and how do you hold hands with others across from others? What areas of interest are you in? How do you apply this in your own kind of either work life, wherever you go? Because I think people travel on holidays and you see these things anyway. What do you do? What do you, when you witness some of your stuff, or when you're getting these treatments? Because for me, I still, definitely around, as I said before, about educate, agitate, and organize is really around knowledge being a point of action and pushing us towards action. And the idea of, I think it's Paulo Freire who talks about oppressed and oppressor, and talks about it's not really, when we're challenging and we're asking for shift and change in situations and power, we're not really asking that we change positions and I become the oppressor and the other person becomes the oppressed. Really not. It is around bringing humanity and pulling humanity together, all of us, and disallowing this dialectic to continue to exist. And one way of doing that is obviously, if you're really interested in challenging systems, is you also lose power. And I know the reason even for like creating the collective and having space for white people to continue learning and checking in and holding each other to account was a space, because when that happens, there's also a shift within you. And it's being able to be supported whilst that shift is happening of losing that power, because whether we like it or not, people get used to power. And if you're losing it, there's something there that also shifts alongside. So the idea of, and this point really being the one I really wanted to kind of push more on the debt that is owed. So this, I say this because a lot of time in spaces I've been in and people are talking about doing for, they're saying they're working for and liberating them. Yes, even I've kind of like shared in the concept of centering the most marginalized and supporting people who are in worse situations like myself. But this is not just for them, I'm doing this for me as well. So with that concept I shared around injustice and what happened and what we could have done, the idea of liberating myself is also in there. And that liberation, or not taking action, because when I take action, I'm liberating myself from that feeling that I get when I don't do anything. And that liberation is also healing, not just me on a personal level, it's healing everything around me. So, and that's really what I wanted to kind of like hone in on, because that is also planet repairs, and planet repairs is not just to do with climate, is the people, is everything around, and the plants, and taking care rather than using and abusing, which is kind of what we have said. And this last one, as a way of something that we kind of move, we should be seeking and heading towards the indigenous, because at first I was thinking indigenous is the people who were there before, and then actually the more I've got to read and understand, indigenous is people who look after the people who are looking after. So and that is a spiritual way of life. It's not necessarily going and praying, and we're not asking for that. It's just existing in a way where we believe it's not just what we have around us, is not just about us or for us. There's much more than that. And if we're doing that, we look after everything, including caring for people in detention centers, people who are locked away, people who are suffering from mental health, and which are all signs of a sick society. It's kind of catering for all of that. And that, as I say, is kind of for our own collective and liberation and healing. I'll stop there because, because of time. And I know we were going to have a break, but I'll pass back to Maya.
Thank you so much, Penny. I'm sorry we can't give you a proper clap because we're not in the same space, but if people want to come off mic and clap, feel free.
Woo!
Whoop, whoop. Yeah, thank you so much. So we've got a bit of time now just to debrief in pairs, or 1-3 in pair and pairs. So the questions that we were thinking were, I'll put them in the chat now if they're still on my, So how have the 5 pillars, how might the 5 pillars apply to you or your work? And how is doing anti-racism work liberating you? So I'll just open those now and we'll rejoin back here in 10 minutes. Bye, Sue.
I haven't been asked to join a room.
You haven't? Oh, sorry. Why is that?
Hi, Sue.
Hi, Penny.
Is that your cat? Yeah.
Yeah, she's got very sharp claws, so I'm flinching with her. She needs.
Oh, I'm sorry, Sue. Are you still there?
Yeah, it's a bit wobbly, so I don't know if I do with it.
You should have a room now with Jane. Does it come up?
Yeah, it's not asking me. Ah, okay, good.
Yay. Nice to see you.
It didn't take me there.
Oh, it says not joined. Not sure what to do.
I can just stay. Is it not? Oh, I can't even suggest anything because I don't even know how to do it.
Oh, she's gone now. Not hooray, she's gone, but you know. You want to be in a room? Well, actually, I'll pause the recording.